The howl of wolves pierced the night as Grace Russell gripped the reins tighter, her knuckles turning white with fear. She hadn't planned on traveling through Blackwater Forest after sunset, but a broken wagon wheel had cost her precious hours of daylight, and now she was paying the price. The year was 1879, and the Washington Territory was still wild and unforgiving, especially for a woman traveling alone. Grace had left Walla Walla 3 days ago, determined to reach her uncle's homestead near the Idaho border before winter set in. At 22, she had already endured more hardship than most women twice her age. Orphaned at 16, she had spent the last 6 years working as a seamstress in town, saving every penny until she could afford this wagon and the supplies needed to start a new life. Now, as shadows danced between the towering pines and the eerie yellow eyes began to appear in the darkness surrounding her wagon, Grace wondered if she would live to see that new life at all. "Easy, boy," she whispered to her horse, a nervous gelding named Thunder who sensed the danger all around them. The animal whinnied in distress, stamping his hooves against the forest floor. The first wolf emerged from the underbrush, its massive gray form illuminated by the lantern swinging from Grace's wagon. Then came another, and another, until she counted at least 8 of them, circling the wagon with deliberate, measured steps. Grace reached for the rifle beside her, knowing her chances against a whole pack were slim. She had learned to shoot from her father before he passed, but these were too many, too hungry and too determined. "Dear Lord," she prayed, her breath forming small clouds in the cold autumn air. "Please help me." As if in answer to her prayer, the crack of a gunshot echoed through the trees. The wolves scattered momentarily, their attention diverted by the newcomer who thundered into the clearing on a powerful black stallion. The rider wore a dark coat that billowed behind him like wings as he charged through the pack, firing another warning shot into the air. His hat was pulled low, obscuring his features, but even in the dim light, Grace could see he was tall and broad-shouldered. "Get down," he called out to her, his voice deep and commanding. Grace ducked as he circled her wagon, firing again when one of the bolder wolves lunged toward Thunder. The wolf yelped and retreated, but the pack wasn't giving up easily. "Can you drive?" the stranger called out as he drew alongside her wagon. "Yes," Grace replied, her heart racing. "Follow me and stay close." He wheeled his stallion around and started ahead, cutting a path through the wolves. Grace snapped the reins and Thunder lurched forward, the wagon bouncing wildly over the uneven ground. She followed the stranger's lead, trusting this unknown savior as he guided her through the dark forest. For what seemed like hours, they traveled in tense silence, the only sounds the creaking of the wagon, the horses' labored breathing, and the distant howling of the wolves that had fallen behind but not given up. Finally, the trees began to thin, and Grace spotted the warm glow of a cabin ahead. The stranger dismounted swiftly and approached her wagon as she pulled to a stop. "You're safe now, madam," he said, offering his hand to help her down. As Grace stepped into the pool of light cast by the cabin's windows, she got her first clear look at her rescuer. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with striking blue eyes that stood out against his tanned skin. A few days' worth of stubble covered his strong jaw, and when he removed his hat, she saw thick dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Thank you," Grace said, her legs trembling with relief and exhaustion. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "Vincent Harrington," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "Most folks call me Vince." "Grace Russell," she replied, noticing for the first time the blood staining his left sleeve. "You're hurt." Vincent glanced down at his arm as if just remembering the injury. "One of the wolves got too close. "It's nothing serious. Let me tend to it," Grace insisted. "It's the least I can do." Inside the cabin, Grace found it simple but comfortable. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. A table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed occupied most of the single room, with a small kitchen area in one corner. As Vincent shrugged out of his coat and rolled up his sleeve, Grace saw 4 parallel gashes where the wolf's claws had caught him. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound with whiskey from his own supply and bandaging it with strips torn from a clean cloth she found in his cupboard. "What brings you out to these parts alone, Miss Russell?" Vincent asked as she tied off the bandage. Grace explained about her uncle's homestead and her plans to help him run it after her aunt's passing the previous winter. "Uncle William wrote that he could use an extra pair of hands, and I was ready for a change." Vincent nodded. "Blackwater Forest isn't a place for lone travelers. Even experienced men avoid it after dark." "I didn't intend to be there so late," Grace explained. "My wagon wheel broke, and repairs took longer than expected." "You're lucky I was passing through," Vincent said, his expression grave. "Those wolves have been growing bolder since the logging camps moved in and disrupted their hunting grounds." "Why were you in the forest at night?" Grace asked, suddenly curious about her mysterious rescuer. A shadow passed over Vincent's features. "I was tracking someone. A man who robbed the bank in Ridgefield 2 days ago. I'm a bounty hunter, Miss Russell." Grace tried to hide her surprise. She'd heard stories about bounty hunters, dangerous men who lived by their own code, yet Vincent had risked his life to save her without hesitation. "Will you continue your search tomorrow?" she asked. Vincent shook his head. "The trail's gone cold. Besides, I need to make sure you reach your uncle's place safely. It's still a day's ride from here." "I couldn't ask you to. You didn't ask," Vincent interrupted with a small smile that softened his rugged features. "I'm offering." That night, Vincent insisted Grace take the bed while he slept on a bedroll near the fire. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she listened to the wolves howling in the distance and watched the firelight play across the face of the man who had saved her life. Morning came with a gentle rain that pattered against the cabin's roof. Grace awoke to find Vincent already up, frying bacon in a cast-iron skillet. "Hope you're hungry," he said when he noticed her stirring. "We've got a long ride ahead." After a hearty breakfast, they set out. Vincent had tied his horse to the back of her wagon and sat beside her on the driver's bench, his rifle across his lap. The rain had stopped, but the forest was shrouded in mist, giving it an otherworldly appearance. "Have you been a bounty hunter long?" Grace asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. 5 years, Vincent replied. "After the war, it seemed like the only thing I was good at." "You fought in the Civil War?" Grace asked, surprised. He would have been very young. Vincent nodded. "Joined up at 17, right at the end. Saw enough fighting to last a lifetime, though." He paused, then added, "What about you? You mentioned you were orphaned." Grace explained how influenza had claimed both her parents within a week of each other. "I stayed with a neighbor for a while, then found work at Mrs. Prescott's dress shop in Walla Walla. She taught me to sew properly, and I saved enough to buy this wagon and supplies." "That took courage," Vincent said, his admiration evident. "Most women would have remarried quickly for security." "I had offers," Grace admitted, "but I couldn't bring myself to marry without love, not even for convenience." Vincent fell silent, and Grace wondered if she had said too much. She stole a glance at his profile, strong and steady as he scanned the trail ahead. There was something about him that made her feel safe, yet also awakened feelings she had never experienced before. Around midday, they stopped by a clear stream to rest the horses. Vincent disappeared into the trees and returned with 2 rabbits, which he quickly dressed and prepared for cooking. "You're quite skilled at surviving in the wilderness," Grace observed as she helped gather wood for a small fire. "Necessity teaches you quickly," Vincent replied. "I grew up in St. Louis, didn't know a thing about hunting or tracking until the war." As they ate, Grace found herself sharing stories from her childhood memories of her father teaching her to fish in the creek behind their farm. Her mother's prized recipe for apple pie that Grace had memorized, the small joys and sorrows that had shaped her life. Vincent was a good listener, laughing at her humorous tales and offering quiet sympathy for her losses. In return, he shared bits of his own past his father's work as a blacksmith, his mother's dreams that he would become a teacher rather than a soldier, his younger sister who had married a banker and now lived in San Francisco with 3 children. "You ever visit them?" Grace asked. A shadow crossed Vincent's face. "Not for several years. My line of work. It changes a man. Sometimes it's better for family to remember you as you were, not as you've become." Grace wanted to argue, to tell him that families should accept each other regardless, but something in his expression stopped her. There was a depth of pain there that she couldn't fathom. They continued their journey in the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing as they left the dense forest behind and entered rolling hills covered with golden grass. By late afternoon, they crested a ridge, and Vincent pointed to a column of smoke rising in the distance. "That should be your uncle's place," he said. Grace felt a rush of excitement mixed with unexpected regret. Soon, she would reach her destination and Vincent would go his own way. The thought saddened her more than it should have after just one day in his company. As they approached the homestead, a figure emerged from the small cabin, waving enthusiastically. Grace recognized her uncle, older than she remembered but still standing tall and strong despite his 60 years. "Grace," William Russell called out as they drew closer. "I was beginning to worry." Grace jumped down from the wagon before it had fully stopped and rushed into her uncle's embrace. "Uncle William, it's so good to see you." After their reunion, Grace introduced Vincent, explaining how he had saved her from the wolves in Blackwater Forest. William insisted that Vincent stay for dinner at the very least, and reluctantly, the bounty hunter agreed. The homestead was modest but well kept. William had built the cabin himself 10 years earlier when he and Grace's aunt had decided to leave Oregon for the Washington Territory. A small barn housed 2 milk cows and a few chickens, and a vegetable garden, now mostly harvested, stretched behind the cabin. During dinner, William regaled them with stories of frontier life, while Grace described her journey from Walla Walla, carefully omitting just how terrified she had been when surrounded by the wolf pack. "You're welcome to stay the night," William told Vincent as the evening grew late. "The barn has a comfortable loft." Vincent hesitated, glancing at Grace. "I should be moving on." "Please," Grace said before she could stop herself. "At least rest for the night. You've had a long journey too." Something in her expression must have convinced him, for Vincent nodded. "Just for tonight, then." Later, after her uncle had retired, Grace found herself walking to the barn, a lantern in hand. She told herself she was merely checking that Vincent had everything he needed, but in her heart, she knew she simply wasn't ready to say goodbye. She found him in the loft, spreading his bedroll on the hay. He looked up as she climbed the ladder, surprise evident on his face. "Miss Russell, is everything all right, Grace?" she corrected him. "And yes, I just wanted to thank you properly for saving my life." Vincent set down the blanket he was holding. "You've thanked me several times already." "Not enough," Grace said softly, stepping closer. The lantern light cast a warm glow over them both. "I'd be dead if not for you." Vincent's expression softened. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Grace shook her head. "Not anyone. You risked your life for a stranger. That's rare in this world." For a moment they stood in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then Vincent cleared his throat. "I should let you get back to the house. Your uncle might worry." Grace nodded, disappointed but understanding. "Will you at least stay for breakfast before you go?" Vincent smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. "I'd like that." The following morning, Grace awoke early and headed to the kitchen to prepare a special breakfast. She was kneading dough for biscuits when her uncle joined her. "He's a good man, that bounty hunter," William observed, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Despite his profession, Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Yes, he is." William studied her for a moment. "You like him?" It wasn't a question, but Grace answered anyway. "He saved my life, Uncle. Of course I like him." William's knowing smile told her he wasn't fooled. "There's more to it than gratitude, I think." Before Grace could respond, the door opened and Vincent stepped inside, his hat in his hands. "Good morning," he said, nodding to them both. Breakfast was a lively affair, with William telling more stories of his early days in the territory. When the meal ended, Vincent helped clear the table, then announced it was time for him to depart. Outside, as he saddled his stallion, Grace stood by, struggling to find the right words to express her feelings. "Where will you go?" she finally asked. Vincent tightened the saddle's cinch. "There's a wanted man in Idaho territory I've been tracking for months. I'll head that way first." Will you pass through here again?" Grace ventured, her heart racing. Vincent paused, looking at her with those intense blue eyes. "Would you want me to?" "Yes," Grace admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I would." Vincent stepped closer, close enough that Grace could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "This life I lead, it's not one I'd wish on anyone, especially not someone like you. I'm gone for months at a time. I make dangerous enemies." "I'm not asking for promises," Grace said, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "Just, don't be a stranger, Vincent Harrington." A smile tugged at his lips. "In that case, Miss Russell, I suspect I'll find myself passing through these parts again before winter." He mounted his horse with fluid grace, tipped his hat to her, and rode away. Grace watched until he disappeared over the ridge, a mixture of hope and longing filling her heart. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as Grace settled into life at the homestead. She helped her uncle with the autumn harvest, preserved vegetables for winter, and set up her sewing machine in a corner of the cabin, already taking in work from neighboring farms. William never mentioned Vincent again, but Grace often caught him watching her when she gazed toward the ridge where the bounty hunter had disappeared. October gave way to November, and the first snow dusted the hills, melting by midday but a harbinger of the winter to come. 3 weeks after Vincent's departure, Grace was returning from delivering a mended shirt to the Petersons' farm when she spotted a rider approaching from the east. Even at a distance, she recognized the powerful black stallion and the straight-backed posture of its rider. Her heart leaped as she urged her horse faster, meeting Vincent halfway between the Peterson place and her uncle's homestead. "You came back," she said, unable to keep the joy from her voice. Vincent's face was more weathered than she remembered, with a new cut healing above his right eye, but his smile was warm. "I said I would." He stayed for 3 days, helping William repair the barn roof before the heavy snows came and chopping enough firewood to last well into winter. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, and Vincent shared carefully edited tales of his bounty hunting adventures, while Grace worked on her sewing and William carved small wooden figures, a hobby he had taken up after his wife's death. On the 3rd evening, William retired early, complaining of a sore back from the roof work. Left alone, Grace and Vincent sat in comfortable silence for a time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft click of Grace's sewing needle. "I should leave tomorrow," Vincent finally said, his voice low. "There's word of a job in Montana Territory." Grace set down her sewing. "Must you go so soon?" "The work doesn't wait," Vincent replied, but she could hear the reluctance in his voice. "And winter's coming. The mountain passes will be treacherous soon." "Will you come back?" Grace asked, the question that had been burning in her heart since his arrival. Vincent rose and crossed to her chair, kneeling before her so they were at eye level. "If you wish it." "I do," Grace whispered. Vincent took her hand in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I've thought of you every day since we parted," he admitted. "It's not wise, I know that. My life is dangerous, unpredictable." "Life itself is dangerous and unpredictable," Grace countered. "My parents weren't bounty hunters, but death found them all the same." Vincent's expression softened. "You have wisdom beyond your years," Grace rustled. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Vincent leaned forward. When his lips met hers, Grace felt as though her heart might burst from her chest. The kiss was tender, questioning, and over too soon as Vincent pulled back, his eyes searching hers. "I have nothing to offer you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "No home, no stability." Grace touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "You offered me your protection when I needed it most, with no thought of reward. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you are." Vincent left the next morning, but not before promising to return by Christmas if humanly possible. Grace watched him go with a lighter heart than before, the memory of his kiss warming her despite the chill in the air. December brought heavy snows, transforming the landscape into a pristine white wilderness. Grace and her uncle settled into winter routines, with long evenings spent by the fire, reading aloud from the few books they possessed, or simply talking. William spoke often of his late wife, sharing memories that had been too painful before but now brought comfort. As Christmas approached, Grace found herself watching the road more and more often, hoping to see Vincent's familiar figure. 2 days before Christmas, a blizzard descended, bringing howling winds and snow so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet from the cabin. "He won't come in this," William said gently on Christmas Eve, finding Grace staring out the window into the swirling whiteness. "No one would be foolish enough to travel in such conditions." Grace nodded, fighting back tears. "I know, I just hoped." The blizzard raged through the night and into Christmas morning. Grace and William exchanged small gifts, a carved wooden bird from him, a new woolen scarf from her, and prepared a modest feast with a chicken from their coop and preserved vegetables from the cellar. As they sat down to eat, a sound cut through the howling wind, 3 sharp knocks on the cabin door. William rose, his hand automatically reaching for the rifle propped nearby, but Grace was faster, rushing to the door with her heart pounding. When she pulled it open, Vincent stood there, covered in snow, his face reddened by the cold but his eyes bright as they found hers. "Merry Christmas," he said simply. Grace pulled him inside, her hands trembling as she helped him remove his snow-crusted coat. "You came through the blizzard. You could have frozen to death." "I made a promise," Vincent replied, stomping snow from his boots. "Besides, I found shelter for most of it. Just rode the last few miles this morning when it let up some." William shook his head in amazement but clasped Vincent's hand warmly. "You're either the bravest or the most foolhardy man I've ever met. Come, sit. You're just in time for dinner." That evening, after William had again retired early with a wink to Grace that made her blush, Vincent presented her with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much," he said as she carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a silver locket on a delicate chain, its surface etched with a simple floral pattern. It's beautiful, Grace breathed, opening the locket to find it empty. I thought you might put a small likeness in it someday, Vincent said, suddenly seeming unsure of himself. If you wanted to, that is. Grace closed her hand around the precious gift. I'll treasure it always. She hesitated, then added, I have something for you too. She retrieved a package from beneath her bed, a leather-bound journal with Vincent's initials tooled into the cover, and a new pen with a steel nib. For your travels, she explained as he ran his fingers over the soft leather. So you can write down your thoughts when we're apart. Vincent looked up, his expression vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. No one's given me a gift like this in years. Do you like it? In answer, Vincent set the journal aside and drew her into his arms. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, more certain, filled with longing and promise. When they finally parted, both breathless, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you, he confessed. It scares me, Grace. Why? She whispered. Because I don't deserve happiness, not after some of the things I've done. Grace pulled back to look into his eyes. Everyone deserves happiness, Vincent. Everyone deserves love. Vincent stayed through the remainder of the blizzard, which kept him at the homestead for 3 more days. In that time, Grace learned more about him, how he had tracked down his first bounty almost by accident, how he preferred the wilderness to towns and cities, how he had once dreamed of owning land and raising horses. When the weather cleared enough for safe travel, Vincent prepared to leave again, promising to return in the spring. This parting was harder than the last, but Grace faced it with greater confidence. Something had changed between them during his Christmas visit, a deepening of trust, an acknowledgement of feelings that could no longer be denied. Winter gradually released its grip on the land, and as March brought the first hints of spring, Grace found herself watching the eastern ridge more and more often. William, busy with preparations for planting, pretended not to notice, but his knowing smiles told Grace he understood her anticipation. Vincent returned as promised, arriving on a mild April day when the wildflowers were just beginning to dot the hillsides. This time he stayed for 2 weeks, helping William plow and plant, repairing fences damaged by winter storms, and spending every available moment with Grace. They took long rides together, exploring the surrounding countryside and talking about everything and nothing. Vincent spoke more openly about his past, the nightmares that still haunted him from the war, the first man he'd killed as a bounty hunter, a murderer who had slain a family in their beds, his struggle to maintain his own moral code in a profession that often attracted men with none. In turn, Grace shared her dreams of perhaps opening a dressmaking shop someday, of traveling to see the ocean, of creating a true home after years of feeling rootless. On his last night before departing again, Vincent took Grace for a walk under the stars. They stopped by a small stream that ran through William's property, the water gurgling peacefully over smooth stones. I have to go to California, Vincent said, breaking the comfortable silence. There's a bounty on a man who's robbed 3 stagecoaches. The reward is substantial. Grace nodded, fighting her disappointment. When will you leave? Tomorrow, Vincent replied. But Grace, I've been thinking, this could be my last hunt. Her heart quickened. What do you mean? Vincent took both her hands in his. I've saved most of what I've earned these past years. It's enough to buy land, build a modest house, maybe start a horse ranch like I once dreamed. You'd give up bounty hunting? Grace asked, hardly daring to hope, for the right reason. Vincent's eyes held hers steadily. For the right person. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Vincent. I'm not asking for an answer now, he said quickly. I need to finish this job first. Prove to myself that I can leave that life behind with no regrets. But when I return, He hesitated. "When I return, I want to ask you a proper question with a proper ring, if you'll allow it." Grace felt tears of joy spring to her eyes. "I'll allow it," she whispered. Vincent pulled her close, kissing her with a passion that left no doubt of his feelings. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I'll come back to you as soon as I can. I swear it." He left the next morning, riding toward the sunrise with a final wave that Grace returned until he was out of sight. Inside, her heart was lighter than it had been in years, filled with hope for the future they might build together. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of activity as Grace threw herself into helping with the spring planting and increasing her sewing work. Several local women had discovered her skill with a needle, and orders for new dresses, mended garments, and household linens kept her busy from dawn until dusk. William, seeing her happiness, began talking of building an addition to the cabin for privacy. "When you two decide to make things official," he said with a wink that made Grace blush furiously. May turned to June, and Grace began to watch the eastern ridge again, knowing that Vincent's journey to California and back would take time, yet unable to quell her anticipation. When June became July with no word, a small seed of worry took root in her heart. "The mail is unreliable out here," William reminded her when he caught her staring at the horizon one evening. "And bounty hunting isn't predictable work. Give him time." Grace nodded, trying to believe her uncle's reassurances. She kept busy, tending the vegetable garden, helping with the hay cutting, and sewing a new dress from a bolt of blue calico that reminded her of Vincent's eyes. In mid-July, a trader passing through brought news that chilled her blood. There had been a shootout in Sacramento between a notorious stagecoach robber and a bounty hunter. The bounty hunter had been badly wounded, the trader said, though the robber had been killed. "Did you hear the bounty hunter's name?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. The trader shook his head. "Just that he was a tall fellow, dark hair, known for always getting his man." For 3 days, Grace barely slept, tormented by visions of Vincent lying wounded or worse in some distant town. On the 4th day, as she was hanging laundry to dry, she spotted a rider approaching from the west, not the east as she had expected. It wasn't until he drew closer that she recognized the black stallion, and the man slumped slightly in the saddle. With a cry, Grace dropped the wet sheet she was holding and ran toward him. Vincent looked exhausted, his face gaunt and his left arm in a crude sling, but his eyes brightened when he saw her running to meet him. "Grace," he said as she reached him, his voice hoarse but warm. "You're hurt," she gasped, noticing for the first time the careful way he held himself, the pallor beneath his tan. "I've been better," Vincent admitted with a weak smile, "but I've been worse too." William appeared from the barn, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern as he took in Vincent's condition. Together, they helped him dismount and into the cabin, where Grace insisted on examining his injury immediately. The bullet wound in his shoulder had been tended by a doctor in Sacramento, Vincent explained as Grace gently removed the bandages. It was healing, but the long journey had taken its toll. "You should have waited until you were stronger," Grace scolded, though her hands remained gentle as she cleaned and rebandaged the wound. "I couldn't," Vincent replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "I made a promise." That night, after Vincent had eaten and rested, he asked Grace to walk with him outside, despite William's protests that he should be in bed. "This can't wait," Vincent insisted. Under a sky ablaze with stars, Vincent led Grace to the same stream where they had parted months before. Though he moved stiffly and with obvious pain, there was determination in every step. "I thought about you every day," he said, taking her hands in his. When that bullet hit me, your face was what I saw. Your voice was what I heard calling me back when the fever set in." Grace felt tears gathering. "I was so afraid when we heard about the shooting." "I'm sorry I couldn't get word to you sooner," Vincent said, "but I'm here now, and I've fulfilled my promise." He reached into his pocket with his good hand and withdrew a small leather pouch. "I said I'd return with a proper ring and a proper question." Grace's heart raced as Vincent opened the pouch and tipped a delicate gold ring with a small pearl into his palm. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I retrieved it from a bank in St. Louis where I've kept it these past years." Carefully, Vincent lowered himself to one knee, wincing slightly at the movement but never taking his eyes from hers. "Grace Russell, I've lived a life of solitude and danger, but you've shown me that there can be more, that I can be more. I love you with everything I am, everything I hope to become. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Grace whispered, tears flowing freely now. "Yes, Vincent, I will marry you." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in a one-armed embrace that was no less powerful for its gentleness. "I have land," he murmured against her hair. 20 acres north of here, near the Columbia River. I bought it before coming back. Good grazing for horses, timber for building. We can start fresh there if you want." Grace pulled back to look at him, her heart full to bursting. "I want that more than anything." Their wedding took place in September, when the hills were golden with autumn light, and Vincent had regained his strength. They married in the small church in the nearest town, with William giving Grace away and neighbors from surrounding homesteads gathering to celebrate. Grace wore a dress of ivory silk that she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs that she had carefully salvaged from her mother's wedding gown. Vincent, standing tall and straight at the altar, looked at her with such love that Grace felt it like a physical warmth enveloping her. William insisted they live at the homestead until their own place was built, giving them his blessing to begin construction on Vincent's land while maintaining a home base with him. "This place is too big for just me anyway," he said gruffly, though Grace suspected he would miss her terribly when they finally moved to their own home. Their first months of marriage were a whirlwind of activity. Vincent threw himself into planning their house, working alongside the local men he hired to help with construction before winter set in. By December, the main structure was complete, a sturdy cabin with 3 rooms and a stone fireplace, ready to be furnished and made into a home. Grace divided her time between helping her uncle, continuing her sewing work, and preparing for their new life. She made curtains, quilts, and cushions, preserving the last of the season's harvest and planning the garden she would plant in spring. They moved into their new home just before Christmas, though they returned to Williams for the holiday itself, unwilling to leave him alone for the celebration. Standing in their own cabin that first night, watching Vincent build a fire in the hearth they had designed together, Grace felt a contentment she had never known before. This was what she had dreamed of, a true home, built on love and shared purpose. "Happy?" Vincent asked, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Grace leaned back against his solid strength. "More than I ever thought possible. You know," Vincent said, his voice thoughtful, "sometimes I think about that night in the forest. If I had been just a few minutes later, or if I had taken a different path." "But you didn't," Grace reminded him, turning in his arms to face him. "You were exactly where you needed to be." "Where I was meant to be," Vincent corrected softly, bending to kiss her. Spring brought new beginnings, as Vincent acquired 4 mares to start his horse breeding operation. Grace planted a vegetable garden twice the size of the one at her uncle's, and started a small flower garden beside the cabin's front door, filling it with wildflowers transplanted from the surrounding meadows. William visited often, bringing seedlings or tools, staying for dinner, and sometimes overnight in the small guest room they had built with him in mind. He and Vincent had developed a genuine friendship, working together on projects at both homesteads and sometimes fishing in the Columbia River when time allowed. By summer, Grace had news of her own to share. On a warm July evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, she took Vincent's hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said, her voice soft with wonder. Vincent's expression transformed from confusion to awe in an instant. "A baby? You're certain?" Grace nodded, her heart full as she watched joy spread across his face. "When?" he asked, his hand still resting protectively over the place where their child grew. "February, I think," Grace replied. Mrs. Peterson confirmed it. She was a midwife back east before marrying and moving west. Vincent pulled her into a gentle embrace, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of promises kept and dreams fulfilled. "I never thought I could be this happy," he confessed. "Never believed I deserved it." "You deserve all the happiness in the world," Grace told him fiercely. "And I intend to spend my life making sure you have it." News of their coming child cemented Vincent's dedication to creating a legacy of peace rather than the violence that had marked his earlier years. He worked from dawn until dusk, expanding their home, building a proper stable for the growing herd of horses, and ensuring that everything was ready for the baby's arrival. In late January, as Grace's time drew near, a bitter cold snap descended on the region, bringing howling winds that reminded her of that night in Blackwater Forest nearly 2 years earlier. The wolves still roamed the wilderness, though they rarely came close to settled areas now that game was plentiful again. On the coldest night of the year, with snow piling against the cabin walls and the wind screaming through the tree branches, Grace felt the first pains begin. William had come to stay with them for the final weeks of her pregnancy, and he rode immediately for Mrs. Peterson while Vincent tended to Grace with a tenderness that belied his nervousness. The labor was long and difficult. Mrs. Peterson arrived just as the worst began, bringing her experience and calm presence to the birthing room. Vincent paced outside until William firmly sat him down with a cup of whiskey and a reminder that women had been bringing children into the world since the beginning of time. In the early hours of February 3, 1881, after 18 hours of labor, Grace gave birth to a son. Mrs. Peterson cleaned and swaddled the baby before placing him in Grace's arms and allowing Vincent to enter. The sight of his wife, exhausted but radiant, holding their tiny son, brought tears to Vincent's eyes. He approached the bed carefully, as if afraid they might disappear if he moved too quickly. "We have a son," Grace whispered, her voice hoarse from exertion but filled with joy. Vincent sat beside her on the bed, one finger gently stroking the baby's downy head. "He's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like his mother." They named him William Vincent Harrington in honor of Grace's uncle and his father. Little Will, as they came to call him, had his father's blue eyes and a tuft of dark hair that promised to be as thick and unruly as Vincent's. Parenthood changed them both. Grace discovered reserves of strength and patience she hadn't known she possessed, while Vincent revealed a gentle, nurturing side that surprised even him. He would walk the floor for hours with the fussing infant, singing old trail songs in a low, soothing voice that never failed to calm the baby. As winter gave way to spring, and spring blossomed into summer, their small family settled into new rhythms. Vincent's horse business began to flourish as word spread about the quality of his stock. Grace took up her sewing again, though now she worked primarily on clothes for Will and items for their home, taking only occasional commissions from neighbors. William split his time between his own homestead and theirs, becoming the doting grandfather that Will would otherwise have lacked. He brought wooden toys he had carved himself and spent hours walking the baby around the property, pointing out birds and animals as if the infant could understand every word. On the anniversary of the night they had met, Vincent surprised Grace with a special dinner after Will had been put to bed. By candlelight, they reminisced about that terrifying night in the forest and all that had happened since. "You ever miss it?" Grace asked. "The freedom of your old life." Vincent considered the question seriously before answering. "I miss certain parts, the open sky, the solitude sometimes. But it wasn't really freedom. I was chained to the past, to the violence. This," he gestured around them, encompassing their home, their sleeping child, their life together. "This is true freedom." Grace reached across the table to take his hand. "I'm glad the wolves circled my wagon that night." Vincent raised her hand to his lips. "So am I, my love, so am I." Life continued to unfold in unexpected ways. When Will was 2, Grace gave birth to twin daughters, Eliza and Emma, who had their mother's golden hair and their father's determined spirit. The cabin was expanded again to accommodate the growing family, and Vincent's horse business flourished to the point where he could hire 2 local boys to help with the daily work. Grace's Uncle William remained a constant presence in their lives until a harsh winter illness claimed him when the twins were 3. They mourned him deeply, grateful for the years they had shared and the legacy he had left them in his love and wisdom. Vincent eventually reconciled with his own family, writing first to his sister in San Francisco and later traveling with Grace and the children to meet her. The reunion was joyful, healing old wounds and creating new bonds between cousins who quickly became inseparable during their visit. As the years passed, their homestead grew into one of the most prosperous in the region. Vincent's reputation as a fair dealer and exceptional horse breeder spread throughout the territory, bringing buyers from as far away as Montana and California. Grace established a small school in their expanded home, teaching not only their own children, but also those from neighboring farms who would otherwise have had no formal education. When Will was 10 and the twins 8, Grace gave birth to their 4th child, a son they named James after Vincent's father. By then, their original cabin had been incorporated into a much larger house with proper bedrooms for each child, a spacious kitchen where Grace taught the children to cook, and a large sitting room where the family gathered in the evenings to read, play games, or simply enjoy one another's company. Vincent sometimes spoke to the older children about his past, sharing carefully edited stories of his bounty hunting days. He wanted them to understand that people could change, that past mistakes need not define a person's entire life. Will, especially, hung on every word, proud of his father's courage while also appreciating the man he had become. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Vincent took Grace riding to a hilltop overlooking their property. The autumn day was crisp and clear, the surrounding hills painted in gold and crimson, their home nestled peacefully in the valley below. "Did you ever imagine we'd build all this?" Vincent asked as they dismounted and spread a blanket for a picnic. Grace looked out over the land. They had tamed together the neat fences enclosing pastures where Vincent's horses grazed, the orchards they had planted, the gardens that provided much of their food, the house that had grown room by room as their family expanded. "No," she admitted with a smile. "But then, I never imagined a handsome bounty hunter would charge through a pack of wolves to save me, either." Vincent laughed, the sound echoing across the hillside. At 48, his dark hair was threaded with silver, and lines fanned from the corners of his eyes, but he was still as handsome to her as he had been that night in the forest. "Best decision I ever made," he said, pulling her close. "Charging into danger for a beautiful woman in distress. And here I thought marrying me was your best decision," Grace teased. "That wasn't a decision," Vincent replied, his voice suddenly serious. "That was inevitable from the moment I saw you." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, they gathered their things and prepared to head home. Their children would be waiting, along with the two young ranch hands who had become like family, and the neighbors who would be joining them for the anniversary celebration. Mounting their horses, they took one last look at the view before turning toward home. Side by side they rode, just as they had journeyed through life together, through joy and sorrow, through hard work and well-earned contentment. "Race you home," Vincent suggested with a boyish grin that belied his years. Grace laughed, already nudging her horse forward. "You'll lose, Mr. Harrington." "I already won," Vincent called after her. "The day I found you." And as they galloped down the hillside toward the home and family they had built together, Grace knew with absolute certainty that the fear she had felt that night in Blackwater Forest had led her to the greatest joy of her life, a love that had transformed them both, a love that would endure long after they were gone, in the land they had tamed, and the children they had raised, and the stories that would be told for generations to come. The wolves still roamed the distant forests, their howls sometimes carrying on the wind during long winter nights. But now, instead of fear, the sound brought only remembrance of beginnings, of a brave man who had ridden through danger, of a woman who had found the courage to build a new life, of a love that had grown from the most unlikely of meetings into something as enduring as the land itself.